fire engines, we must be in Brooklyn. My name is Steve Guttenberg. This is Herb Reichert. And this today is the story, well, of how we met. But ... It's sort of how I got into horns was through Herb. Because you had, this is like more than 25 years ago, you had Alltech Voice of the Theaters. Herb was living in this amazing loft, converted firehouse on Staten Island. And I went to your place with Mike Trey, and you had these speakers, and I was blown away. I don't usually like that expression, blown away. But
I didn't even know that.
Blown away.
I didn't know you were.
Yeah. So, it's like, well, I remember distinctly, I go to your place. So the first time I went to Herb's was with Mike Trey to set up your LP12, right? That's how this all happened. And I think we met. We were trying to figure this out before we put the camera on. We met because you had your association with Don Garber and Phi, the store.
Which is where I think we must have met.
That's where we met.
Because that's where the invite to the firehouse would have came, and the whole story of the firehouse must have came from there.
Yeah. And your place had the pole, the fireman's pole still. Oh man, I should have done it when I was 30 years younger, 25 years younger. But anyway, I was amazed. So how did you wind up with those speakers, with the Voice of the Theaters?
It's funny. I when I lived upstate, I needed money, and I found old tube amps in the dump, and I repaired them, and I put them on Audio Mart to sell, and I met this guy, Ryoichi Komuro, and he, as opposed to Komuro the amp builder, a different guy, he was a Western Electric dealer. And at first, he just needed somebody to test the transformers and the parts to make sure they were working before he bought it. And we ended up kind of in business together. So we were packing horns. We'd go and buy Western Electric horns, and then we'd test them, make sure they were, not the horn itself, but make sure the drivers, the 555s worked and stuff. And my job was just make sure everything looked and measured right. Okay. But we listened too. And that's how I got into headphones. I had two Western Electric 555s on tripods next to me, which today would be about $16,000 worth of field coil magnets. And I'd put them right there, and then we'd play music through them, stereo, and I could listen on headphones. But once I started doing that, I met Alltech people. And there was a guy, I think, somewhere out west, and I just bought I bought an Alltech Voice of the Theater system from 1947 just to hear it. And then I started buying every horn I could afford.
Pull out of a movie theater, presumably.
Right. Everything was a cinema pole, we called them, and absolutely. And they were old, and they were crusty, and you had to wash them before you could even play them.
And you did stuff to dampen the horn, right?
No, I'm against dampening the horn. Okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them. I still believe in 1970. What people don't realize is J. Gordon Holt of Stereophile, his reference system, 1970, was an A7 Voice of the Theater, which he describes very well. The sound, it had a mid-range to die for. And he was using, I think, Marantz Model 9. At one point, I didn't even know it, but I had the same system he had in the firehouse, a Garrard 301, Marantz preamp. I didn't like the Marantz stuff hardly at all, but I repaired it. And that got me into tubes. I started trying to find the right amp to go with these big horns.
Wow.
So I got into Western amps for a while.
Wow. I didn't know that part. But anyway, I was there, and I think you played a Frank Sinatra record. And it was maybe Only the Lonely. That would have been logical. And he was so there. Frank was in the room. I never heard, and this was when I was working at Singer, and we were playing, $80,000 Wilson speakers. It's nah, that's nothing. This is the real deal, hearing Frank coming out of those Voice of the Theaters. Now, the thing is, speaking of distance from the speakers, I had to be at least 15 feet away from those speakers.
Oh, more than that. Probably 25 feet.
Yeah, because it was a really big space. So I was plenty of distance. And it was freaking amazing.
Well, what's interesting, though, is Frank, I believe, had Altec, the smaller, he had small Altecs, the home version of these speakers
Okay.
in his apartment. I think he had 3 channels if the photograph isn't lying.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that those recordings were mastered on Altec 604s. And I've always maintained that, you know, you want to hear the best of any particular album, play it on the gear from the time the album was recorded or similar equipment. And it will give you I'm sure Frank thought he sounded like Frank on that kind of equipment as well.
Now the thing is, in this chronology, this time, you had already started. No, this was before you were working for Audio Note, right?
Yes, before Audio Note.
Right. So you were hanging with Don Garber and Komuro and
J.C. Morrison.
Yeah, I met J.C. Morrison. Meeting J.C. Morrison in those days was like an explosion.
Right. It still is.
So intense.
He's still intense.
Yeah. I mean, Don Garber was very quiet, and you know, and JC was like, either he was going to hit you, haul off and hit you or something because he disagreed with him, he said. So, yeah, so meeting those guys was incredible. Really, really thrilling. So then time moves on, condensing the story, and then you wind up working for Audio Note with Peter Quartrup.
Which came towards the end of the Firehouse. I kind of stopped those, I called them soirees.
Okay.
And these things, in fact, this should be sort of explained. What we did, Staten Island is the middle of nowhere on some level, and this gear we were playing was so unusual and so few people had ever heard anything like this before that we started inviting people to hear this unusualness. And needless to say, horns weren't popular. Needless to say, 300B tubes. In fact, a real interesting fact for the moment today is in 1989, the end of what we might call the golden era in American, you know, high fidelity, you know, the high end, the Harry Pearson high end era. There were no companies making 300B vacuum tubes, and previous to that, other than a small number of Japanese companies like Shindo or Japanese DIY guys, there were no 300B single-ended amplifiers or 300B anything powering audio systems. Zero. And nobody is making that tube. Now there's a dozen or more people, actually factories manufacturing 300Bs independently. And strangely enough, that year was really, I think, when digital finally, if anybody who was dragging their hind paw about digital came around, I think in 1990, 89. And it was another turning point. I mean, the 90s seemed to me, you were probably more intimate with it, seemed like a changing time for audio. I mean, there's a new high end in the 90s than there was in the 80s or the 70s. But you'd know more.
No, that's true. So the thing is, I had my only 300B amp was a carry that I had.
Right.
I went, even before I was a reviewer, I was going through a lot of stuff. I had a carry 300B, I had the carry 805 amp. I went through stuff, but today you brought the L-Kit, is that how you pronounce it?
The L-Kit TU 8600.
300B amp, and we hooked it up to the Cornwalls, and this is going to be good. This is going to be really, really interesting. So
at a really reasonable price.
At a very reasonable price, yeah, like $1,800, not including tubes. Right. So it's a big circle. So anyway, so time's marching on, and then you start to do this work with Audio Note, which led to you're like going crisscrossing the country many, many times, right?
It was all about driving an old Mercedes and Europe. I think Mike Trey and I drove, don't laugh, 78,000 miles in 3 years in America.
Wow.
In an old Mercedes, or one or another old Mercedes, or some variation on that thing, which is crazy. I mean,
was Shindo happening at that point in the U.S.?
Well, I should point out, the way I discovered personally 300Bs wasn't even so much through Western. My guy I was buying and selling Western with, we were buying these tubes, but I never actually heard a 300B amp until I went to his apartment, and he had a complete Shindo system. He had a turntable, he had a Shindo preamp, and he had a Shindo 300B single-ended amp. All I could do was marvel on the color of the Western Electric logo on the 300B.
The lightning bolt.
And I had never really seen tubes with that kind of fat Venus of Willendorf kind of shape.
Yeah.
There was something just physically and aesthetically attractive. I mean, Shindo green is a pretty cool color, but to see that and this yellow together really stuck. And then she played, don't laugh. We also bought for collectors, because we were selling in Japan, we bought every Julie London record we could find. And if it was shrink wrap, still so much the better. So we played Julie London record on a 300B through Altec 604 in the original 612 boxes. And I was just like, I had never heard anything like it. That was my first real 300B experience.
But was Audio Note and Shindo in competition with each other?
I don't think they even knew about each other in the 80s. I mean, by 1992, I don't think Audio Note even made a 300B or a single-ended amp until into the 90s, definitely. Until probably later than, Audio Note Japan made it. Audio Note Great Britain didn't. And we didn't sell we didn't sell too many at Audio Note. We didn't sell too many 300B amps. We mainly sold Ongaku.
Okay.
Which at the time was 90 grand.
Yeah, you sound like a lot, but that was a lot of money.
That was a lot of money back then.
Okay, so we're marching forward in time. But up to this point of the story, you still have the Voice of the Theaters?
No, when I started with Audio Note, I needed speakers. I had the Audio Note speakers, of course, but my space was too big.
Right.
I mean, even the biggest Audio Note, the A&Es, were too small for the space. So I needed a horn speaker, and Mike Trey and I, actually, don't laugh, we visited Jonathan Vallon at his house, and he had the trios.
Right.
And I remember walking in the door with Mike, going, Mike, I don't know what speaker this guy has, but it's really good. I think we're really going to like this.
This is the introduction to avant-garde.
Right. And it was the avant-garde. He had a pair of avant-garde trios. And I just wanted to buy them. I mean, and I don't think anyone had ever heard of them much at that time. I certainly hadn't. And we bought a pair, and we met the guys who owned the company, and I said, you need an importer? And I said, yeah. And I said, I'll do it.
Right.
And that was how we started with them.
So this was a modern horn. You
Right.
went from the old horn to the
Big fiberglass. It came in any color German cars were painted in.
Right. Red,
Whatever
yellow,
German
yeah.
paint. And the one Mike and I used a lot between us was that it was not a German color. It was this Lexus Metal Flake white.
Yeah.
But it really looked good on fiberglass horns, and they were big. I mean, the mid-range horn was probably, 40 inches or more in diameter, and it was 3 horns. That's why they called it a trio, and it had an active woofer, and I don't remember sensitivity numbers, but I also, and Steve mentions it, but he didn't mention it in one of his videos. When you're looking for a speaker to use with the 300B, for example, look for a high impedance. Don't pay any attention to the sensitivity.
Right.
High flat impedance, it'll drive it.
Right.
These were really good like that.
Sensitivity is overrated.
Sensitivity is overrated.
I couldn't resist.
Yeah.
So since it was still fresh, you're living with the Voice of the Theater, and you go to this modern horn. How did that, was it jarring to go from?
No, that's a really good question, and I think, to be honest, I'm pretty sure that's why we understood, or I understood, what these trios were doing with these avant-garde. First, you got to kind of get over is it a horn coloration? I mean, and you kind of got to get used to the presentation. One of the things the Voice of the Theater did that was really interesting is it would put the performer, if it was Frank singing, he was literally standing in front of the speakers, full height. Well, full height,
It's a big speaker.
And it was really kind of cool. No one that I knew had ever experienced that. If you heard it on, say, your audiophile speakers, he'd be smaller and he'd be behind the speakers. So when I heard the avant-garde, what they did was smoother, kinder, more refined, not as noisy, grainy. They were quieter. They were refined. You could put them in a beautiful living room. You couldn't put a voice of the theater. It was something that was meant never to be seen. It was behind a screen.
Heard but not seen.
Right. The avant-gardes were, we've been in apartments lately, really rich guys' apartments, and they look beautiful. I mean, they're just like, and you would never put a Western horn in there. And that was my take. I said, these are horns for like real people,
Right.
and they're
Real rich people. Yeah.
yeah, they weren't at the time.
You gotta be rich.
They weren't free,
Right.
but they were smooth and refined and elegant, and they could play a big orchestra in a way that boxes with little domes and
Right.
stuff couldn't do.
So tell the story about when you were in the firehouse and you still had the voice of the theater and you had Watt puppies between them.
I almost just told that. Okay, this was fun. These were soirees where I started to explain. We would invite people to, and by we, I mean me and my, triode mafia friends, we'd invite people over for what we called soirees. And the idea was to present new ideas about horns and low-powered tubes and even phono stages and things like that. When we would introduce products made by our friends, and one day, and it was kind of interesting, I started meeting a lot of people, and somebody loaned me a pair of Watt Puppy 2s. And I set them up between not the avant-gardes, between the the Altec Voice of the Theater A7s, and I played some Schulte Wagner LPs with the Koetsu on the LP12 with a MDC 800 arm, and they sounded really amazing on the Watt Puppies, and I played it for everybody, and everyone was like, wow, that really sounds good. And the Schulte Wagners, the mics are about 6.5, 7 feet high off the ground, maybe 7.5 feet high, and there's 4 of them. It's a quad. And they had marked out in the studio, the Decca studio, they had marked out the floor, and the singers actually moved around. So they were giving the impression that you were looking at an opera, listening to an opera slightly from above, like maybe from a box seat. And it was a beautiful impression, and you could just watch the singers move underneath. But on the Watt Puppies, it was like it was on a coffee table. And when we switched to the Voice of the Theater, it was the full size. I mean, you felt like you were still above them, but it was 40 feet across.
Wow.
Another time, I came home from work, and my theory is you always let your wife, your children, whoever play your stereo. Why not? What's the worst case scenario? And I came home and the Rolling Stones were playing. My wife obviously was playing this. I think it was Live If You Want It.
Okay.
And I'm coming up the stairs, and I'm coming from a construction job, and I'm really tired and I'm really dirty, but I can hear the Stones in the stairway. And it sounds live. And I opened the door to the firehouse, to the main room, and it really, to me, it sounded like walking into a real auditorium with the real Stones playing. The Watt Puppies could not do this. Interesting moment.
I'd say, yeah. I think we're going to leave a cliffhanger there. I think that's what we're going to do. We're going to stop there.
Okay.
But first, a word from our sponsor. And this is an ad, so to speak. An ad, that's too strong a word. This is to let you guys know that, like Herb and I talk all the time, now you can too. Yeah, we're going to set up this thing that you can, have a phone chat with Herb wherever you are, and for a fee. And these kind of conversations, they're not just happening because it's Steve and Herb. Herb is always like this. He's always just filled with ideas about music and art and movies and everything. And I think it would be fun for you guys to have chats with Herb. So here's...
And to be heard.
And to be heard, exactly.
If you have ideas, I will listen.
Yeah, and here's how you're going to do it. You're going to reach out to Herb at earthlink.com at Ishmael.
Earthlink.net. Net.
Yeah, sorry.
Pay no attention to the audio
Yeah,
feeling.
don't pay attention. But anyway, there you go. That's the address. That's his email. And start a dialogue with Herb, so to speak. And that's it. So I think, as I like to say, my work here is at last complete, thanks to Herb. And this is always fun with Herb. And I think this may have been the best one we've ever done. I like this being on camera at the same time.
I like being on camera. I like jabbering.
Yeah,
he and I'm always amazed. I wish you could have heard the conversation in the car on the way over.
Yeah. Herb thought, can we really talk for more than 7 minutes? And how many minutes is it? Yeah, anyway. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope to see you back here again very, very soon. Bye-bye.
Stay well.